From the National Air and Space Museum, President George Bush.
By some, it's been called the epic of flight. By others, simply the evolution of aviation. The art of flying has, in any event, captured the hearts and minds and imagination of nearly every American. It began when Wilbur and Orville Wright first sputtered aloft in this primitive, fragile machine. And from that historic success on the windswept sands of Kitty Hawk, we've traveled to the thundering, exhilarating drama of America's lunar landings, Skylab, and the shuttle. And throughout this brief but exciting history, one man, perhaps more than any other, kept literally generations of Americans up to date on each and every aviation and space first. That man we honor today. His name, Lowell Thomas. It was my privilege to count Lowell as a good friend. At his death on August 29, 1981, he was deeply involved in the development of the unique documentary you're about to see. And so here's to you, Lowell, from the producers, from all of us. Thanks for sharing your special understanding of the great events and remarkable personalities of the 20th century. Our airborne 21-gun salute to you.
I absolutely could not have conducted the shuttle diplomacy without Air Force One.
It also has a tremendous impact wherever it goes.
It's not a luxury palace. It's a working place.
It's kind of your private turf. You don't feel you're on a plane. You can conduct business easily, and it was marvelous.
Now the newest airborne adventure. You're looking at SAM 28,000, the first Boeing 747-200B as Air Force One. We've added a few more flying surprises from our former presidents, and we'll go aboard this new wide body for a personal tour, and this time share a personal conversation with President George Bush. I'm Charlton Heston. As you might imagine, history and aviation and the American presidency have always been especially interesting for me. Presidential flight really started back in 1943. It was a cold January the 7th in Manhattan. By late morning, Pan American pilots Howard Cohn and Dick Vinell got word that something important was about to happen. From Washington, the Navy Department directed that 2 of Pan Am's mammoth transoceanic clippers be readied for a secret mission. Cohn and Vinell were ordered to fly from New York's LaGuardia Marine Terminal to Dinner Key, just outside Miami, Florida. They got there early the next morning. Both pilots were told to prepare for a dawn departure on the 11th. The passenger manifest they got was puzzling. It wasn't until 12 days later that Mrs. Cohn learned who was on board.
It was about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, dark in January, and he went down to the airplane and signed the papers that had to be signed, and he noticed that passenger list was headed by a name Mr. Jones, and the second name was Admiral Leahy and Harry Hopkins and other dignitaries, and it was just at that moment that Howard realized he was carrying President Roosevelt on his first flight in office.
At this West African port fronting the Atlantic Ocean arrives President Roosevelt for his conference with Prime Minister Churchill. He drives in a scout car after having flown across the ocean. It is the first time that he has flown since becoming American president, and he is the only president to travel in a plane while in office.
The contrast between presidential air travel then and now is staggering. The straight line distance between Washington and Casablanca is 3,875 nautical miles. A modern jetliner could have made the trip in just 7 hours. FDR's flight required 4 legs of flying, 3 stopovers, a change of planes, and 3 full days of travel, each way. In addition, the routing touched 3 continents, crossed the equator 4 times, and took nearly 90 hours in the air, which included the president's 61st birthday celebration. When you include round-trip rail transportation from Washington to Miami, President Roosevelt covered some 17,000 miles before he was once more back in the White House. Just weeks after Roosevelt's Casablanca flight, the Army Air Corps brass decided to provide a custom-tailored airplane with the special mission of flying the president. Their choice, the C-87 Liberator Express. The pilot, Major Henry Myers, christened it Guess Where To. But Roosevelt never flew aboard it. In the fall of 1943, a Douglas C-54 was built and customized for presidential duty. It was known as the Sacred Cow. This aircraft became world famous. For a short time, Cow also served Harry Truman. Then, a custom Douglas DC-6 with a spectacular eagle paint job became the president's plane. In honor of Truman's Missouri hometown, it was called the Independence. FDR opened the era of presidential flight. Harry Truman established it. The men who flew Truman remember him. Flight attendant Bob Hughes.
Normally when we flew, there was a press plane that always went with us carrying some White House people, some Secret Service people, and additional press people. And always they wanted to get down. We would have to circle most of the time before we'd land so they could get in first and let the photographers and everybody get off and take pictures of him coming off the airplane. So remember one time we were going to Key West for 2 or 3 weeks, and we got down there and he talked to Colonel Myers and he said, Hank, let's just go straight in this time. He says, we'll play a little joke on those guys. So we landed first, and he got a pad and pencil and went down the steps and went over to the press plane when I landed, and he stood at the bottom and jokingly interviewed the press guys coming off the airplane, and they all got a big kick out of it.
Truman's in-flight birthday cake. Independence pilot Frenchie Williams.
Well, the president usually got around to going to Kansas City on his birthday. And the crew would chip in and buy him birthday cake. Big birthday cake, happy birthday, Mr. President, and so forth, candles. And this one particular year, we thought we'd go all out, and we had this cake made, had it in the galley. So we were going to take it into the president, wish him a happy birthday. And we couldn't get the cake in the door. Big cake like that. We couldn't even dip it up and get it in the door. So we had to go back and say, Mr. President, you'll have to come forward to the galley to cut the cake. And he said, just like the guy that built the boat in the basement.
When Dwight Eisenhower swept into the White House, a Lockheed Constellation was selected from Special Air Missions, or SAM for short. Ike named it Columbine 2 for the flower of his wife Mamie's home state, Colorado. Eisenhower preferred flying to all other kinds of travel. He was also the first American president who was a pilot in his own right. Ike was completely at home in the air. Mamie wasn't. First Officer Bill Thomas and Steward Bob Hughes.
I guess at best you'd describe Mrs. Eisenhower as a timid air traveler, because she did not like to fly without the president.
Any weather we saw or encountered en route always bothered her, and she would always call one of us back there, one of the stewards, and say, would you go up front and make sure Bill Draper knows that those things are there out there, those clouds and those thunderstorms?
We might not even have considered it, but she'd have a little note up there asking about that big thunderstorm or that big black area over there. We'd have to come back with a comment that we're not going that way.
Mamie christened Ike's final plane, a super constellation, Columbine 3. In the Summer of 1959, Sam accepted delivery of 3 identical new Boeing 707 executive jets. Ike used these 3 interchangeably while retaining Columbine 3 as his official presidential aircraft. Eisenhower's unprecedented 11-nation jet tour started December the 4th. For Ike, it was a stunning whirlwind success. Early in the Eisenhower administration, on board Columbine 2, an incident occurred that would change forever the call sign of an airplane carrying the President of the United States. Taking off from Washington and climbing to 10,000 feet over a certain checkpoint, Columbine called in on a new radio frequency as instructed. Roger 610 answered the controller, and 10 seconds later, another plane's transmission was heard. Center, are you calling Eastern 610? Negative, was the reply. We're calling Air Force 610. This in-flight confusion could have been dangerous. First Officer Bill Thomas.
Well, when we got back, Bill Draper got with the Air Force operations people and with the Federal Aviation Agency and cited this as a reason why we needed a more positive control system. And he recommended that we use Air Force One for the call sign of an airplane when it had the President on board.
Jerry Parr, former Assistant Director, Protective Research, U.S. Secret Service.
The code names are delivered to the Secret Service, of a number of code names, and the Secret Service chooses those names on the basis of probably some personal attribute of the person that we protect. For example, with Vice President Humphrey in the mid-60s, his code name was Lightning, which certainly fitted his energetic character, his activism, but basically that's the way we do it.
Through the years, call signs and code names have been specifically useful not only to identify the President and the First Lady and their children, but also key members of the administration, other people, even places and things. John Kennedy, presidential air travel officially entered the jet age. In 1962, Sam took delivery of a Boeing 707 intercontinental jet, number 26,000, with a striking new exterior designed by Raymond Loewy. It captured perfectly a strong, tasteful sense of national purpose and the American presidency. In late June of 1963, Kennedy embarked on his memorable journey to Berlin. His military aide, Major General Ted Clifton.
It was probably one of the most important diplomatic occasions that occurred in his presidency. It was very important that the Germans be assured and reassured of our faith in them, and it was all planned throughout so that he would bring Germany together as well as bringing us together. And as you know, Chancellor Adenauer and Willy Brandt, who was the mayor of Berlin, were political competitors. And Willy Brandt was working to be the next chancellor. And so we had to handle that very carefully. And again, the president used Air Force One to accomplish something. He just suggested that they both ride with him to West Berlin. And Willy Brandt knew that he would get off the airplane with the president, which was good for him politically. But Adenauer also knew that as the incumbent chancellor, he wasn't being shut out of the game. And Air Force One performed a very important diplomatic mission.
There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin.
Former White House AP correspondent Frank Cormier.
Well, I never saw crowds, I don't think, anywhere in one day as we saw in West Berlin. I suspect 6/5 of the population must have been in the street. It was just enormous. And when he gave that famous speech, and I won't try the German.
Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
President Kennedy had a special way of masking a personal habit he indulged in on board Air Force One. Colonel Joe Soffit explains.
President Kennedy was fond of cigars. Generally, he had a cigar in his mouth when he was ready to deplane from the aircraft. And while they were getting the greeting ceremony ready outside, he would usually have that cigar in his hand. And just before he stepped out of the aircraft, he put that cigar in his left pocket and would walk down the stairs, generally, with his hand in his left pocket. You understand that he had quite a few holes in those suit pockets. Why they didn't make them out of asbestos, I don't know.
On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, it took Air Force One exactly 13 minutes to fly from Carswell Air Force Base, Fort Worth, to Love Field outside Dallas, Texas. It was scarcely long enough for Colonel Jim Swindoll to lift Camelot's new wings above the clouds. The President and Mrs. Kennedy had come to Texas to mend some political fences. Waving aside concerns about hostility, Kennedy ordered that the bullet-resistant bubble top be removed from his limousine. In retrospect, that directive became perhaps the most tragic single order ever given by a president on board Air Force One. The rest became a keenly etched memory for all America and the world.
I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the Trade Mart. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff has just announced that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago.
In the horror and confusion that followed Kennedy's death, Aircraft 26,000 became a place of refuge and security. Before leaving Dallas with the slain president's body and Mrs. Kennedy aboard, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, elected to take the oath of office aboard Air Force One. One of these frames, captured by photographer Cecil Stoughton, became the single most reproduced photograph ever taken aboard a presidential plane. On that hushed and painful flight back to Andrews, Colonel Jim Swindoll, Air Force One commander.
And it was almost eerie, quiet, because we didn't have to do much talking. We were on a direct flight, and it's very simple navigation. And FAA gave us anything we wanted, and in hushed tones, everybody was just seemed like they were saluting the president.
For 3 days, television sets across America carried unblinkingly the details of Kennedy's state funeral. There was, at the personal request of Mrs. Kennedy, a final salute from Air Force One and its crew.
Well, she said, Jack loved Air Force One and flying, and said, certainly if it could be arranged, do you suppose they could do the flyover? And it was her idea, and it was said just like that.
Following Kennedy's death, Sam 26,000 became Lyndon Johnson's plane. LBJ rode his big jet like a range boss in a cattle drive, dashing here and there, around the globe, rounding up stray politicians and prime ministers, dispensing his own brand of wisdom, handing out money from the American chuck wagon, radioing ahead for more diet root beer and Texas-sized steaks. It wasn't long before Lyndon Johnson began placing his very special brand, not only in the American presidency, but on the president's plane as well. Former White House correspondent Frank Cormier.
The main passenger cabin forward of his was changed with all the seats reversed, so all the passengers flew backwards. And they looked through a plastic transparent wall at Johnson in what we called his throne chair, and he would be facing forward, facing his fellow passengers.
Flight engineer Joe Chappell.
The president's chair was a large Hartman aircraft seat, and it was designed and installed to fit around or in the kidney-shaped conference table that was electrically operated. We could move the president's desk in the conference area from the coffee table height to the writing desk or dining height.
LBJ also held very strong beliefs about leaders around the world.
Nikita Khrushchev had just been deposed as the premier of the Soviet Union. And Johnson, over a highball, leaned back and said, look around the world. Khrushchev's gone, Nehru's gone, Adenauer's gone, Macmillan's gone, Senier's gone. Who's left, de Gaulle? And then he leaned back and literally thumped his chest and said, I am the king.
Since the advent of the intercontinental jet, American presidents have embarked on literally dozens of remarkable journeys. Often, world events or the unpredictability of some presidents leaves little time for advanced planning. Lyndon Johnson's military aide and pilot, Jim Cross.
President Johnson called me in my office there at the White House, and he said, Jim, I want you to get my big airplane ready. We're going to have to go over and pay our last respects to Prime Minister Holt. And I said, well, Mr. President, you might remember, sir, we put that big airplane in the overhaul hangar about 3 or 4 days ago, and you had approved its going. And in one of his very Texan-like homilies, he said, well, just run up there and get it back. He said, we're going to take that airplane. I said, Mr. President, I was up there yesterday, and I looked at the plane. It'd take at least 10 days just to put the pieces back on it. He said, well, I don't know why it is, but every time that some of you folks get to doing something, you mess up my plans. He said, see if you can find me another airplane, which we did. We took one of the backup planes. We fitted it out for him, more or less to his liking, so that we could take it. And 2 days later, we left on this particular incredible journey. We were gone just under 4 days. I think it was 121 hours. We spent 61 hours in the air, and we stopped in Honolulu. We stopped in Australia, 2 different places. We stopped in Bangkok, or near Bangkok, I believe it's Korat Air Force Base. We stopped in Karachi to see the president of Pakistan at that time. We then stopped to see the Pope on the eve of Christmas. I think it was the night of the 23rd. And we flew from there on to Lodges, and then on back into Andrews. We arrived here, as I recall, it was Christmas Eve morning, about 7 o'clock, having been gone some 121 hours.
There was a bizarre, little-known ending to Johnson's final flight aboard the presidential plane. Ralph Albertazzi, Nixon's Air Force One commander.
President Nixon had made the gesture, of course, of wanting the now former president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, to go back to his home state in Air Force One. They got to Austin, of course, and when they got there, I got a phone call, not really a frantic phone call, but kind of a phone call of concern from Paul Thornhill. He said, Ralph, you're not going to believe this, but we've been ordered to take everything off the airplane. And when I say everything, they took the matches that had the presidential seal, they took the cigarettes that had the presidential seal, they took the tissues, the towels, the dishes that Jackie Kennedy had arranged to put on board the airplane that had special flavor and special significance to the airplane alone. All those things were gone. And the most important thing was that the conference room chair that the president used all the time, we call it the king chair, well, they took that seat off too. So the airplane came back from Austin without the king chair and all the other amenities.
$26,000 became Richard Nixon's Air Force One.
So help me God.
Nixon ascended to the presidency partly because of his campaign pledge that he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. When Ralph Albertazzi signed on as presidential pilot, he hadn't the faintest clue he was about to become one of the prime smugglers of all time. The plan came directly from President Nixon. It involved clandestine flights to Europe, where National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was to meet secretly with the North Vietnamese. Dr. Kissinger.
I absolutely could not have conducted the shuttle diplomacy without Air Force One. And I might add, there were not many volunteers for that sort of thing in the rest of the administration. So we approached the Vietnamese through General Walters, who was then military attaché in Paris, and suggested a private dialogue, and they accepted it. What I often did, in fact almost always did, is to go to some party in Washington and go straight from the party to Andrews and take off.
And he was always with some sort of an adornment called a pretty girl, and generally somebody well-known, and all of them beautiful, and he had developed a reputation for being a ladies' man as a result. But he would show up at these receptions and these things, and after a reasonable length of time making sure that everybody had seen him, he would call for his White House car, would come up and pick him up, and they'd jump in the car, and off they would go into the night, with everybody in attendance suspecting that Henry was going out for a great weekend, you see. And he would drop the girl off at whatever place she was staying or her home and proceed to the airport, where he'd jump on the airplane, and we would head off for our meeting in France or Germany or England or wherever the case may be. Then we would get back some 24 hours later, 36 hours later, and Henry would make a show at the White House on Monday morning, and all the newspaper people would see him with these bleary eyes and worn expression, and they would think, my God, what a great weekend he must have had.
But it hasn't all been smooth flying. In April of 1970, there was an in-flight incident that nearly unmasked the secret negotiations and could have destroyed them forever. Enter Major General Vernon Walters, military attaché at the American Embassy in Paris.
Saturday, I received a phone call about 5 o'clock, very urgent, from Secretary Haig, who indicated to me that something had gone wrong with the aircraft.
As we were going along, the engineer came up and says, you know, we're losing hydraulic fluid. I don't understand it.
And they really needed to get to Frankfurt to get the hydraulic system fixed, and that they didn't want to land and take off and then fly with the landing gear down, because that would have blown the cover right there, since no one would have believed they flew across the Atlantic with the landing gear down.
So about 3 hours later, about 8 o'clock at night, 8:30, I got another phone call from him, and he said, it's going to land in the worst possible place, Frankfurt, Rhine, Main, where he will certainly be recognized. And the North Vietnamese had told us that if there was any publicity, they would break off the negotiations. And you've got to do something. And I said, well, I will do something. And I wondered what I would do. I sat there maybe for 10 or 15 minutes after I hung up. And finally, I decided I'd walk up the street to the President of France's palace. I had just taken him around the United States about 2 or 3 months before, so I knew him a little better than the military attaché normally knows the president. So President Pompidou listened to my story, called his airplane at Villers-Coublay Airport, told me, go out there, and my plane will take you to Rhine, Main, and pick up Kissinger. We flew eastward to a beautiful night, and soon we pulled up behind the aircraft, the Air Force One. And we followed it into Frankfurt. It landed ahead of us. I walked up into the airplane, and Dr. Kissinger was sitting there looking rather dejected. And he said, am I glad to see you? What are we going to do now? And I said, Dr. Kissinger, take off your glasses, roll up your coat collar, walk down the ladder, walk up the ladder of the small French airplane. We'll move your baggage and your aids. And it's the only time in my life I've ever seen a meek, obedient Henry Kissinger doing exactly as he was told.
How Walters managed that, I will never know, because he not only had to track down the French, but he also had to square it with the Germans, and to square it with the Germans in a plausible way so that they wouldn't check into who was on that plane.
We got in and took off, and about half an hour after we took off, the French pilot, Colonel Calderon, asked me to come up front. And he said, "General, what am I going to tell the Germans? They know this is the President of France's airplane. They know that in the middle of the night, without getting a flight clearance, without filing a flight plan, we penetrated German airspace. The bells are ringing all the way from Switzerland to Denmark." The end of the story is simply this, that a couple of days later I saw the French pilot, and I said, "Calderon, did the Germans come?" He said, "General Walters, when I got to my office the next morning, the German air attaché in uniform was waiting for me." And I said, "What did you tell him?" And he said, "I told him what we'd agreed upon, namely that it involved a woman." And I said, "Did that satisfy him, or did he have any other questions?" And he said, "Just one." And I said, "What was that?" He said, "Well, he leaned forward confidentially, tapped me on the knee, and said, 'Tell me, is President Pompidou's lady German?'"
For those connected with the mission, it became known simply as Cherchez la Femme. It was 11:30 a.m. local time, February 21st, 1972, when Air Force One touched down in the capital of the People's Republic of China. Richard Nixon's flight had stunned the world. Then, and for the rest of that unprecedented journey, the world at large was treated for the first time ever to live color pictures of an American president moving through the exotic sights of mainland China. It was on the PRC pre-flight to arrange Nixon's visit that Albertazzi made a mischievous suggestion to Kissinger.
Colonel Albertazzi, who was a good friend of mine and a terrific guy when he didn't dive the airplane, was suggested that really to impress the Chinese, I should sit on the left-hand side of the cockpit as the plane was taxiing in for a landing, and make the Chinese believe that I had flown the plane myself.
The Chinese are going to look up and say, "Oh my God, he can fly too."
And I tell you, that was a tempting suggestion, because they had done more research on me, and they knew more about me than I did. But that's one thing they wouldn't have known, and it would have really created havoc in their intelligence system.
Well, you know, he said, "Albertazzi, tell you what I'll do it." Well, he didn't do it. And I used to kid him about it. And I remember subsequent to a lot of the things that took place, I was kidding him about it one time. He said, "Well, you know, Albertazzi, I'll tell you something. If I thought this administration had a sense of humor, I would have done it."
If Air Force One is the pinnacle of America's aviation and maintenance excellence, that has not always been the case with its Russian counterpart. It was during Nixon's 1972 Moscow summit with Leonid Brezhnev that Soviet airworthiness became the subject of some embarrassing world headlines. Frank Cormier.
Leaving Moscow on one occasion, we just sat and sat and sat. In fact, we didn't leave. We just sat there. And it was finally announced that there was some mechanical problem, and we would not be able to take this aircraft.
Former Air Force One navigator, Colonel Jim Bazzelli.
Shortly, we saw a covey of people just running over towards the aircraft, opening up the cowling, started looking around. And I turned to my Russian counterpart and I said, what seems to be the problem over there? I don't understand. And he looked at me and he was very serious and he said, "I don't know, but somebody is in very big trouble."
The Russians were fit to be tied. They had made a huge issue of using their airplane, which they claimed was better than ours and safer than ours, or at least as safe as ours. Then we get on the plane and the miserable thing wouldn't start. But Kosygin was the one who was most outraged by that failure. And considering that the Secret Service had been claiming all along that these airplanes weren't reliable, this was a huge embarrassment to them.
Press Secretary Ron Ziegler.
I had gone out at that time because I saw the press corps sitting there wondering what was going on. And they had blacked out the entire departure ceremony on Soviet television and every feed to the world.
During all of this, Premier Kosygin introduced to Nixon one of the ranking Soviet Air Force officers and said to the president, this is the man responsible for this, what shall I do with him? And Nixon said, well, by all means promote him, because at least he found out what the trouble was before we got off the ground.
After 10 years of service, SAM 26,000 was replaced by a new 707, SAM 27,000.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The first presidential resignation in history.
As I recall, the high...
Richard Nixon's final flight as president was at hand. Colonel Albertazzi.
We set the stage, the crew, for this final departure as we normally would for any trip to California, with a backup airplane and the alternate crew and those kind of things. And one of the things that we had to do, of course, was to provide for the fact that the president, somewhere along that flight, was not going to be the president anymore. We watched his presentation. We have television capability on board the airplane. We watched his final remarks to friends and employees at the White House.
I want to say for each and every one of you, not only will we always remember you, not only will we always be grateful to you, but always you will be in our hearts and you will be in our prayers. Thank you very much.
We left Washington, D.C. Andrews Air Force Base at 10:17 in the morning. We were Air Force One.
Ford Press Secretary Jerry Terhorst.
The decision had been made by the National Security Council that on the final flight to San Clemente, the black box would not be on that plane, even though President Nixon would be president actually for almost an hour after he left the White House.
And just where was the little black box?
The black box, sometimes called the football, it's the box of the codes and the encoding ciphers which accompany a president of the United States wherever he goes in this country or abroad. There's never more than an arm's length from him if he needs it in case of a nuclear attack. Because certainly when Jerry Ford became president at 12, the box should be with him and not on some airplane going west.
Chief radio operator Van Valkenburg.
It was a very quiet flight. We were instructed that Air Force One would cease being as of the time that Mr. Ford was sworn in. So I, being the chief communicator on that last flight, I called the audiovisual section in the White House. They in turn patched up one of the microphones on the podium where Mr. Ford was being sworn in into the airplane. I monitored it. I put it over the PA system throughout the airplane so the people in the back could hear it.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability, preserve...
Something like 2.5 minutes after 12, 13 miles southwest of Jefferson City, Missouri, at 39,000 feet, when Gerald Ford said,
"So help me God."
So help me God.
We ceased being Air Force One, and we immediately then changed the call sign to SAM 27,000, and we proceeded to San Clemente with that kind of a call sign rather than Air Force One.
It was obviously a dramatic moment, a silent moment. But President Nixon handled that entire situation, I think, with great dignity. And, there was no substantial emotion that occurred, but I would say more or less reflection. But it happened on Air Force One.
Nixon flight steward Lee Simmons.
But later on in the flight, President Nixon called me in his compartment, and I had the opportunity, I thought, to get to explain to him how I felt and wanted him to know that it was a sad day for me. But really, before I could really get to him and tell him how sad I was and how disappointed I am this day is happening, he started to console me and tell me that, Lee, tomorrow's another day. You hang in there, keep your chin up, and hang in there and fight them all the way. He said, don't worry about a thing. Everything is going to be fine. And
and he got up and put his arm around me and hugged me and wished me and my family well. So I left out of that compartment with tears in my eyes, because here I was trying to console him, and there he was consoling me.
It was some 20-25 minutes after the swearing-in ceremony, the president came out. First time that I'd seen him after the boarding of the airplane. And as he is wont to do, and perhaps some people who know him better than I do, but he had a tendency to roll his hands just a little bit. When he didn't put them in his pocket, he kind of rolled them around. And the way he looked around and looked at me, he said, "Ralph, you know, I promised you before we went to China, when we got back, I was going to make you a general." And he said, "Like so many things that I've got to leave undone." And his voice trailed off, and I said, "I understand, Mr. President."
Former Nixon aide, Steve Bull.
Generally, crowds were generated during the Nixon presidency. We had a lot of things on our minds, and the last thing on our mind was generating a crowd out at El Toro. It was totally a spontaneous event, and it was very, very moving. I recall seeing strangers with tears in their eyes, and it was the final outpouring of emotion from a very turbulent and emotional period of time.
As I step off the Spirit of 76, this great plane that took us to China, to Russia on 2 occasions, to the Mideast, this great Spirit of 76 is one that we will always remember because of those trips.
Came over, we had this picture-taking session. Once again, he said, "I'm sorry that it has to end this way." And I said, "I understand, Mr. President." He walked over to the helicopter, and I saluted and turned around to the crew, and I said, "Well, folks, it's time to get this airplane back for President Ford."
When it comes to political campaigning, Air Force One is a very real plus for the sitting president. Ford Press Secretary Ron Nessen.
There's quite a bit of difference, especially during a presidential election campaign, and I guess presidential election campaigns now run the whole 4 years, between a candidate who arrives in a city in this great glistening symbol of American authority and power, and the other candidate who arrives in a chartered 727. And I think all presidents try to maximize the impact of that symbol. At one point in the presidential campaign of 1976, there was the idea that Air Force One, when it was taking President Ford to some campaign stop, would make a low-level pass over the field and then turn around and land. And that is a very dramatic symbol of presidential authority, and it was to remind everybody that this was the president. The other guy was just a candidate who had to charter his plane.
For a time, the specter of assassination also dogged Gerald Ford, first in Sacramento, and then just days later in San Francisco. Former President Ford.
When I came out of the St. Francis Hotel, she took a shot at me. They pushed me in the limousine, and we made about as rapid a trip from the St. Francis Hotel to the San Francisco airport as one can imagine.
But Mrs. Ford had not been with him. She had been on a little separate trip of her own down to Monterey, and she arrived on the plane just a few minutes after he did, but not knowing what had happened.
She walked into the area where we were sitting, and her comment to me was, as she saw us sitting there, "Well, how did they treat you in San Francisco?"
I think they were the calmest ones aboard the plane on the flight back, because there was a lot of nervousness on the staff about what had happened and what a narrow escape it had been.
There's no doubt that Air Force One, for all intents and purposes, is truly a very visible extension of the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. I might add, a president can get a lot of work done on Air Force One as he flies to Europe or as he flies to the Pacific. You had your staff there. You had all the intelligence information, the working papers. You could communicate with anybody. So it was a workshop as good as the Oval Office itself.
For President Ford, there were occasional embarrassments connected both with Marine One, the presidential helicopter, and Air Force One.
We landed in Salzburg. It was a very wet, rainy day. And as I came out of the Air Force One, I had an umbrella in one hand, and I was trying to hold Betty's arm with my other hand. And inadvertently, I tripped and took a bad spill. Fortunately, because I'd learned how to fall when I was playing football and competing in other athletics, even though I fell 3 or 4 steps, I rolled and got up and had no injuries whatsoever.
Thank you for your gracious welcome to Salzburg, and I'm sorry that I tumbled in.
After it all happened, I kidded Betty and said, why did she push me?
On January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter became the 39th President of the United States. Perhaps no chief executive in recent memory was more dedicated to eliminating the ostentation of the presidency. His concerns stretched even to the amenities aboard Air Force One. Former President Carter.
Well, within the White House and the Oval Office, the working spaces that I occupied at Camp David on Air Force One, in my own private life as president, I tried to cut down the waste of money and the ostentatious nature of the presidency. Some of my predecessors, and I say without any criticism, had given quite expensive gifts, for instance, to everyone who came on board Air Force One, kind of like it was a mercantile establishment where people would carry away mementos, quite costly to the American public. It was just contrary to my nature. And so we did away with that element of Air Force One.
Press Secretary Jody Powell.
I personally was grief-stricken when I found out that he had banned the free cigarettes from Air Force One. It seemed to me that was one of the things I was looking forward to enjoying, is a free cigarette. So when you smoke as many as I do, then it makes a big difference. But I suspect in many ways, yeah, I mean, the doing away with the limousines for the White House staff and so forth, my impression was that nobody noticed that but us.
But people could always take with them a pencil or a scratch pad or a book of paper matches, just as a proof that they had been on board the beautiful plane. But I felt quite at home on Air Force One, and always felt when I was there that I was not isolated up in the sky somewhere, but had direct access to members of the Congress, to friendly leaders of nations, and in case of an emergency that I could talk to the Kremlin or to any other place to deal with an emergency that might arise.
During the final year of his presidency, Carter was deeply involved in gaining freedom for 52 Americans held hostage in Iran. Their release stretched into Ronald Reagan's inauguration. The new president asked his predecessor to fly to West Germany and welcome back the former captives.
Getting those hostages home safe had been a preoccupation of the administration in which I served for over a year. It had finally happened. And I think all of us were certainly grateful to the new administration for making that trip possible, particularly possible under the circumstances in which it took place. And I remember coming back, one of the staff members had thought to purchase and have loaded on board some champagne to drink. And we're standing there in the president's cabin with a glass of champagne.
And my toast was to those who had shown through their stamina and patience and courage that our nation's principles were intact. And of course, my toast also included one to freedom.
On October the 6th, 1981, word of Anwar Sadat's assassination flashed around the world. In an appropriate response, Ronald Reagan, who was still recovering from the recent attempt on his own life, asked former Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter to join the official U.S. delegation to the funeral in Egypt. Their departure on the 8th was a sad, though historic moment at the White House.
I want to express a heartfelt thanks to Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Mrs. Carter for undertaking this sad mission. Their presence in Cairo will express to the Egyptian people the depth of America's grief and sorrow at the loss of a great leader and a beloved friend.
Pilot for this mission, Lieutenant Colonel Monty Stokes.
Cairo, and I don't think we found out who was on the trip until probably an hour before we took off. I'm sure there was a lot of jockeying. Sadat was a very popular man, and a lot of folks from Washington wanted to go and pay their last respects.
The steward, Chief Howard Franklin.
Well, the unique mission as it was, having all these former presidents on board, so the protocol and the seating was a prime concern of us, but because of the configuration of the aircraft, there was only certain things that we could do. So the Secretary of State had the stateroom.
President Nixon, President Carter, and myself sat in the staff lounge, not the working lounge, because that was occupied by Secretary of State Haig and his staff.
So the presidents were riding steerage, which they weren't used to, seeing their former subordinate keeping the presidential compartment. So there was a lot of tension on the way over.
And just what did our three former presidents find to talk about aboard the president's plane?
I hate to tell you, but there were not very many profound conversations going on. It was more everybody was maneuvering, making little remarks.
We had a long talk about Sadat, how each one of us had seen him from a completely different perspective under different circumstances. It changed over a period of 10 years or so.
We had small talk at dinner. We reminisced about our personal experiences with President Sadat, and each one of us had dealt with him, negotiated with him, had become a personal friend of his. One could summarize, talked about what a great tragedy it was that President Sadat had been assassinated.
And I think at one point in the mission, President Carter asked for an Air Force One Bible and brought it in the back, and they discussed possibly some things in the Bible. I don't know exactly what they were, but they discussed history and they discussed the Middle East situation.
In a long flight of that nature, we also had a chance to reconcile with each other some of our varied perspectives on previous political campaigns.
And one thing former presidents talk about to each other is how to raise the money necessary to build and maintain a presidential library. And President Ford has given some advice and has offered some staff help and so forth to President Carter to help get the Carter Library organized. So that may have been one of the subjects they discussed.
But Ford and I came back to the United States with a new sense of appreciation for one another and a new relationship that's now developed into a very close friendship. So I looked upon the trip as very beneficial to me in that respect as well, to understand these two Republican presidents much better than I had in the past.
Mike McManus, former assistant of the president, shares a little of what it's like to fly the Oval Office.
Well, I think we're probably one of the few countries in the world where the President of the United States, when he travels, takes, in effect, the White House and the Oval Office with him, because he's continuing to be the President at the time that he's away. We'll go out with a full entourage, which does about 35 to 40 people, including some press people, so that they can take a look at the technical aspects of getting this story back to the American people. And then we'll send out what we call our advance team about 2 weeks ahead of time, usually for a large foreign trip. And that will include a contingent of experts not only in advance, and that's essentially logistical planning, but also military support people, press people, communications people, security people. It gets to be quite an involved part of our planning. It really is picking up the White House and moving it someplace else in the world.
On June 23rd, 1983, Ronald Reagan invited us to fly with him aboard 27,000. Welcome aboard Air Force One, President Ronald Reagan.
It's a better office than any I have. I can get more done on this plane. For example, I do a lot of letter writing. I have a lot of mail that I choose to answer myself. And that mail can pile up and be quite a stack. And I can get on this plane, and on a trip like this, I can come back with a tablet full and all the letters attached to it and hand it in at the office to be typed and for my signature. There is instant communications, and not only with the White House, but many times there have been international conversations from this plane, and on a secure phone. I have found that, like in so many things domestically and so many things in every other part of our lives, the face-to-face, getting to know the other heads of state on a personal basis, I can actually say that we have established personal friendships with these people. And as I say, maybe you could have done it less conveniently to have such a meeting, but this has made it that much more possible.
27,000's flight deck. Here we asked Reagan's pilot, Colonel Bob Ruddick, what's it like to fly the president?
I feel that we spend so much time together, it's not often a commander-workers relationship. We would pretty much work on the same level to get the job done. And if you could, you might say there's no star on the crew. Everybody is very down to earth. Everybody pulls together from the same level just to accomplish the mission of flying the president.
And that digital clock up there that tells you your destination, and then here they put when you're going to arrive. I know it's a matter of principle and honor with them, with that crew. But this plane lands, and this plane taxis to the stopping point, and I stand here or sit here time after time watching, and those wheels, you see that tarmac stop. The wheels have stopped turning as that clock clicks to the exact minute that it said that we would arrive.
From cockpit to aft galley, a short tour of 27,000. was January 20th, 1989, when George Bush took the oath of office. From that moment until late summer 1990, Bush became the 5th consecutive president to be served by SAM 27,000 as Air Force One. It was now 18 years old. Its backup an unprecedented 28 years old. During the first year and a half of his presidency, our energetic 41st Chief Executive logged some 205,000 miles of flight. The president's new pilot, Colonel R.D. Danny Barr, and his crew airlifted Bush and his aides to the island of Malta for a storm-swept first Bush-Gorbachev summit in December 1989. Colonel Danny Barr, Air Force One commander.
The terrible weather really did not affect us that much in Air Force One. The weather was just moving in as we arrived, so we virtually beat it to Malta. They did have a rough 2 days, especially on the ship. And then, as would have it, as we boarded the airplane and got ready to depart, the sun was shining, and we had some scattered showers that were still moving through, but as far as us moving the airplane, it was very pleasant. However, for the President's Day, it was rather uncomfortable, I believe.
On February 15th, 1990, to Cartagena, Colombia, for a one-day cocaine interdiction summit with the presidents of 3 Latin American nations.
The president and his staff came out around 9:30 the night before. We put them to bed on the airplane. They slept through the night. Sometime around, I believe, 4 o'clock, we as an air crew boarded the airplane. We taxied out, took off, flew for about 4 hours to Cartagena, and about 20 minutes before landing, the president woke up and wanted to know where we were and how things were going. So I guess in that aspect, it was very unusual.
Mr. President, was this sleepover a security measure?
No, that was a body comfort question, because rather than go out there at 3 in the morning or 4, I just decided it would be easier to tuck in at night, and they made all the arrangements. I don't even remember taking off. And that's one of the things that about Air Force One, you can, it's not only an office, but it can be a home. It was simply just get out there and get a good night's sleep.
So far, we've shared some history, a little of the mission of flying the president. But what about the future? It began here, under Reagan, in the summer of 1986. An Air Force Boeing contract for 2 747-200Bs is the newest Air Force One and its backup. More than a year and a half in delays kept Reagan from flying aboard these as president. Aircraft 28,000 and later 29,000 became our 40th president's legacy to his former vice president. June 26, 1990. A green 28,000 arrives from Wichita for its presidential painting at Boeing's Everett facility. Here you're watching some 12 days of work compressed into seconds. On July 14th, SAM 28,000 goes aloft to be photographed on its way back to Wichita, Kansas. It flew across the faces on Mount Rushmore. Thursday, August 23rd, 1990, the Boeing Military Airplane Company in Wichita. A quantum leap in the saga of America's airborne presidency. At long last, the arrival and official turnover to service of SAM 28,000.
This is a joyous moment for us because we're going into a time on our crew, a time with the Air Force that will take us into the 21st century, that we can well serve our president for many years to come.
Appropriately, in keeping with the delay, the event was low-key. But in both size and versatility, 28,000 has changed forever the mission of flying the president. Of December 1990, it was followed by a second identical 747, SAM 29,000. It was September 28, 1990, when President Bush invited us to chat about presidential flight and the new Air Force One.
I'm told when JFK first saw his Air Force One, which was, I guess, 26,000, he said, "It's magnificent, I'll take it." You got a first comment on this one?
I don't think I could be quite that articulate, but when I climbed on this plane for the first time, I could hardly believe it, because it is roomy and extraordinarily comfortable. I can work on there. I have an office right next to our rather substantial bedroom, and it isn't ostentatious. I think people say ostentatious in the sense that it's a 747 for one person, the President of the United States, but I'm never alone in this job. And secondly, it's common sense, desks, and there are some good communications, and the telephone system is great. It's secure phones and regular phones, so I can do a lot of business just on a short trip.
We can do a lot more with this airplane. We can fly longer, go further distances. We can carry more people. And so in that aspect, yes, it is quite different. And I think the biggest difference is for the President and his staff, we're able to give them a ride that is more comfortable because they have more room. It's a more of a relaxing ride. They're still able to perform all the functions as they would if they were in their office back at the White House, and that's our primary mission, is to give them that support when we're flying them.
The pilot on Air Force One is a colonel now, full colonel, named Danny Barr, Texas A&M guy, and I go up really more out of wonder and curiosity than anything else, and see this instrumentation, talk to the colonel who's our navigator. And it is amazing to me, as an old, throttle and stick pilot, to see the sophistication of the instrumentation on this plane. It is the latest in technology. You can locate yourself to within a pinpoint on a map someplace, and they say it's easy to fly. The first trip that Barbara was on this airplane, we went to Helsinki, the Gorbachev meeting. It was important because we wanted to send a signal to Saddam Hussein that his former close allies were supporting the rest of the world. And it was very easy. It was an easy trip, no stop. Climbed on the airplane, spent the night, woke up, and there we were at noon in Helsinki.
Helsinki was probably a routine trip in all aspects, except for it was the first overseas mission with our new airplane. And we had, obviously, the President and staff on board, and they haven't been flying the new airplane that much, and they were excited about it, and they were running all over the place and getting familiar with it, and everyone's just having a good time with the new airplane.
And I think there'll be more of that. I know I plan to do a good deal of travel. Someday I want to get over and see those kids in Saudi Arabia, and going down to Latin America, South America. And we cannot neglect our friends because we've got crises here or there. So I think in the short, as far as I can see down the road, there will be a lot of travel.
27,000 and 28,000 side by side. A stunning contrast. Size is the obvious difference. A 60% increase in passenger space alone, from the 707's 50 seats to the 747's 93. And this wide body needs 30% less runway than its predecessor. That means some 100+ additional airfields worldwide that can accommodate the presidential mission. A new leg length of 7,000+ statute miles, which can now eliminate costly in-transit refueling and service stops. Because of its new onboard self-contained capability, Gone 2 will be much of the customized stairways, baggage handling, auxiliary power, and air conditioning systems worldwide. And missions can now be flown on much shorter notice. 28,000 and 29,000 are also protected against EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, one result of either airborne or ground-based nuclear explosions. If a regional or international emergency should arise while the president's in either one of these planes, they can also be refueled air-to-air. Now, any mission can be greatly extended if necessary. There's a final and important plus. With the 747 in regular commercial use for more than 2 decades, there's an emergency repair network in place worldwide outside military installations. The mammoth new Air Force One maintenance and supply facility at Andrews Air Force Base. When you fly the president, what's the mood of service you want to provide? Colonel Barr.
I've got an air crew that are professionals. They're dedicated. They do a great job. The president and staff gets on board. The way the stewards talk about it is when the president gets there, the curtain goes up and the show begins.
Flight Steward Howie Franklin.
We try to present a comfortable, professional environment for the president and his passengers. We kind of look at the aircraft as a dinner theater to a certain extent, and every time we take off, the curtain goes up, and not only are the stewards on stage, the whole crew in the United States Air Force is on stage.
Like most of us, you've probably wondered, what's the food like on Air Force One?
My stewards work directly with the White House mess on all the meals that we serve on board the airplane. They know the likes and the dislikes of the first family and the staff, and we coordinate those likes and dislikes with the requirements of the White House mess. We may or may not have the full meal ready when it's time to depart. It's something that they may perform entirely in the galleys on board the airplane during the trip.
With security always a concern, I understand food procurement's handled through a procedure known as random selection.
We do not like to give any credence to shopping at one particular place all the time, so that what it really does for us, it gives us security in the fact that the foods that we buy and that we have for the airplane are good to serve the president. Random selection is we'll have a menu and we have several different places that we will go and shop. We don't necessarily do them in any particular order. We'll go one place one time, we'll go another place another. We do that in civilian clothes, we do that in unmarked vehicles, and we try not to draw attention to ourselves so that no one can say, hey, here they come again.
When you're leaving for foreign travel, do you plan your departure meal in terms of where you're going?
On occasion we have done that. I would say the anticipation normally comes when we leave a country coming back home, that we have a hamburger or a hot dog, which is something that's typically American.
Around the clock and around the world, an unprecedented security system envelops the presidential aircraft. On this, Chief Master Sergeant Hoyt Gamble.
At Andrews, we've spent a considerable amount of money installing a very elaborate and sophisticated security sensor system to protect the aircraft. We always have a contingent of security personnel that flies and accompanies the aircraft wherever it goes. These people are primarily responsible for ensuring that only those people that have a right and need enters the aircraft or comes in close proximity to the aircraft. We depend a whole lot on other police agencies to help us when we are away from Andrews Air Force Base. We start also by soliciting the services of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation. They provide us with a threat assessment for the area we are going to visit. From this threat assessment, we adjust our security. I must say, too, that the crew members have been a tremendous help in the security of the aircraft also. We depend on them, their eyes and ears, to help us maintain security for the aircraft.
Maintenance, too, reflects the Air Force's special dedication to the presidential mission. Senior Master Sergeant Rich Trippinger.
Every day it's looked at, after every flight, before each takeoff, and even when it's in the hangar like this, every day. Like now, it's undergoing a periodic inspection. Every 154 days, the airplane's torn apart and looked at. But this is it's an in-depth type thing right now.
Then on the other hand, if something is broken, if something needs to be fixed, my maintenance crew will work continuously, depending on how long it might take, 2 hours or all night, it doesn't make any difference. We're going to depart on our next trip with a 100% reliable, ready-to-fly airplane. And we will not routinely wait for something to time out before we make a change. we learn, and we did this with the 707, and I'm sure we'll do it with the 747, we learn over the years which parts require changing prior to the standard times that you might see in a manual that says this part should be changed. I've got a maintenance crew that gives me precision, first-class maintenance. No better maintenance in the world, I would say, than what I get out of my airplane. And what I taxi away from the spot with is an airplane that's perfect, and we do that every time.
Welcome aboard Air Force One. The presidential suite. During the day, an ideal area for informal meetings and conversations with traveling heads of state and VIPs. At night, these two couches are turned into full twin beds for the president and the first lady. Adjoining, a dressing area with lavatory and shower. This is the first presidential plane with both full twin beds and shower. The new flying Oval Office is more than twice the size of the one aboard 27,000. The president's desk, chair, and sofa. There's also onboard TV with a VCR unit and a personal communications console, with both open and secure lines connecting him to nearly any spot on Earth. This compartment ordinarily seats 3 top staffers, but in an emergency, it can be quickly converted into a state-of-the-art medical facility. Here, trauma specialists can serve the president or White House staff in the event of all but the most critical injury or accident. There are 2 complete galleys aboard, each equipped with cart lift or dumb waiter. This, in the forward section, provides primary food service to the president, the first lady, top aides, and traveling VIPs. This suite serves as both office and conference area for the president's senior staff. American diplomats, defense officials, and foreign dignitaries are accommodated here. This compartment offers the privacy necessary for those confidential discussions and recommendations so vital to a president traveling abroad. The largest conference facility aboard. Here, a boardroom-type table with seating for 8, sofa, television with VCR, retractable wall maps, and both slide and motion picture projection capability. It's much like the White House cabinet room. Ideal for working dinners for the president, key staffers, and government officials. On long flights, it's by far the best place for large meetings. This area features 2 large adjustable tables with 4 chairs each. 4 stations for secretaries with electric typewriters and photocopy machines. There's even air-to-ground and ground-to-air telefaxing capability. Also 6 additional stations for aides working on individual assignments. And room as well for staff briefings, meals, and R&R. Special guests of the president are accommodated here. There are 10 such fully reclinable sleeper chairs. From here aft, things are much like on a commercial 747. These 34 seats are for Air Force One security guards, Secret Service agents, and the press pool traveling with the president. There, too, the second galley and bank of laboratories. On the 747's upper level, an airborne nerve center, the flight deck. Superior, up-to-the-minute avionics and flight instrumentation. There's a first-ever rest area for the presidential flight crew. The latest in-flight communications marvel. Beamed both to orbiting satellites and earthbound centers, the most sophisticated, open, and secure voice transmission and receiving systems ever. This plus cryptographic equipment for the sending and deciphering of classified messages and directives. As this aircraft is also specially soundproofed, more message lines combined with much more improved line quality mean conversations are both easier to hear and understand. The Air Force One of the future.
The United States, of course, has many well-known international symbols. The White House, Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, the flag, but really only the last of those, the flag, is mobile, can actually show the flag, as they say, around the world. Would you think it fair to say that that Air Force One also represents a mobile symbol of the United States? Is that?
Yeah, well, I know you've been on Air Force One, and I'll tell you, when you taxi up in our country or in some other country, there's a great emotion about it. And it's, I loved, when I go up and shake hands, you know, at the rope line with some kids, I say, was that exciting to see this? Oh, and you can really tell that they were moved, and the teachers bring the kids to see it. And so it has a symbolism that projects. It is a symbol. It is a mobile symbol of the presidency and thus the country.
There's nothing quite like driving back into the airport and looking there across the apron and seeing that big Air Force One.
You get sort of goose pimples when you see the symbolism of the United States.
It is a symbol away from America, of America, and treated with great respect wherever you go.
It has a real impact just because it is a representative of the United States and the President.
There's this beautiful airplane going into the air with the President of the United States, and I've had a part of that. To me, that's very special.
I've been in towns in the United States like Akron, Ohio, and stayed there overnight, and people were out there walking around the airplane all night long. I couldn't believe it, you know. It is a terrific symbol of what America stands for.
Particularly, this is true, I think, in foreign countries where Americans are present and look for a symbol of home, and here's the United States coming in all the wonder and thunder of Air Force One.
And I think that everywhere we've been in the world on Air Force One, and we've been many places, that I could see within the eyes and demeanor of those who welcomed us the same sense that Air Force One at that moment was the United States of America.
When you're abroad and in strange lands and you've been there and you're very busy, and then you arrive back at the airport and your first glimpse of this plane and that flag up there, yes, it's a little bit like hearing the national anthem, and you swell a little with pride.
When people hear Air Force One, that's what they think of as the President of the United States, and we do that throughout the world. So to be the 10th pilot since 1944 to fly presidents, it's great.
our story. For now, it ends with the arrival of the grandest, most versatile ship of state ever, a Pegasus for future presidents, a flying White House magnificently worthy of its call sign, Air Force One. That adventure is just beginning.